Welcome to Nero's Secrets. I'm your host, Jimmy. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more mystery stories. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Man Who Wouldn't Let the Skeletons Rest. There are certain immutable laws of nature. Cats land on their feet. Nero Wolfe hates to leave the house, and millionaires have more skeletons in their closets than coats. So, when Charles A. Farnsworth III, a man with a net worth that could keep every tailor on Fifth Avenue in silk for a century, turned up in our office looking like he'd personally misplaced a body, I knew my morning was shot. It was precisely 11:03 a.m., which meant Wolfe was at the end of his first beer and somewhere in the early pages of Pliny the Elder. Fritz had ushered the man into the office with the caution usually reserved for handling crates marked explosives. And Wolfe, with a glower fit for a medieval monarch, had lowered his book an inch to acknowledge the intrusion. "I don't like rich men before lunch," Wolfe muttered, but I heard it. Farnsworth, either too rattled or too used to being the richest man in any room, didn't blink. He was tall, with the kind of bone structure sculptors pray for, and dermatologists charge a fortune to maintain. His charcoal grey suit had probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. But there was a looseness about him, like the stitches were the only things holding him together. "I need help," he said without preamble, his voice a dry rasp. "You and half the city," I said. "But sure, have a seat. We offer sympathy free of charge. Solutions come with a bill." He dropped into the red leather chair opposite Wolfe's desk, the same chair that had been graced by murderers, millionaires, and once a very confused parrot. Wolfe finally set the book down, steepling his fingers under his chin. "Speak, sir," succinctly. Farnsworth ran a hand through hair that probably cost more to maintain monthly than I made in a week. "There's something wrong at my home. Écoutez, Farnsworth Manor." "An infestation," Wolfe said dryly. "Exterminators abound." "Something more serious," Farnsworth said, leaning forward, lowering his voice like the paintings on the wall might rat him out. "Something or someone is trying to ruin me. They've left things, messages." He hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "A moth pinned inside my closet. Now, I'm not the world's greatest mind. That position was already occupied by the guy scowling at me from behind the desk. But even I knew you didn't call Nero Wolfe in over wardrobe sabotage. There had to be more." Wolfe arched an eyebrow. "A moth. Not just any moth," Farnsworth said. "A death's head hawk moth. It was pinned to the inside of my walk-in closet door, and next to it, a note, written in red ink. It said, 'One secret, per wing.'" I shot a look at Wolfe, but he was staring at Farnsworth like he was considering whether the man was more dangerous as a client or a liability. "Have you," Wolfe asked slowly, "consulted the police?" Farnsworth hesitated. "No, they would ask questions. And there are things, matters that must remain private." There it was. The millionaire's curse. Skeletons in the closet. And someone had finally rattled the door. "And you have reason to believe," Wolfe said, "that the moth, the message, and the need for discretion are connected." Farnsworth gave a jerky nod. "I think someone close to me is trying to blackmail me. Or worse." I caught Wolfe's eye. He didn't love blackmail cases. They usually involved wading through the muck of human nature, and Wolfe liked to observe muck from a very safe distance, preferably with orchids between him and it. But the gleam in his eye said the same thing. My gut did. This one had teeth. Wolfe sighed the sigh of a man facing unavoidable discomfort. "Mr. Farnsworth, why come to me?" "Because," Farnsworth said grimly, "you're the best. And because if this gets out, if my affairs are exposed, there'll be more at stake than my reputation." Wolfe tapped a finger against the arm of his chair. "Money and lives," Farnsworth said, and for the first time I caught a glimpse of real fear beneath the millionaire polish. Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "Very well. Mr. Goodwin will obtain particulars. I will consider whether I will accept." Farnsworth relaxed a fraction, probably the most he'd done in weeks, and turned to me as I pulled out my notebook. "I'll need names," I said crisply. "Anyone with access to your home. Staff, friends, blood relatives, dead enemies, who might be feeling spry." Farnsworth grimaced. "It's a long list." "Good," I said. "We charge by the hour." Outside the brownstone, New York hummed and honked and rattled along. Inside, it got very quiet as Charles A. Farnsworth III began to recount his life, piece by piece, like a man stripping wallpaper off a burning house. And somewhere in that list, hiding between society parties, inheritances, and whispered affairs, was someone who had pinned a death's head moth to a millionaire's closet door, and was just getting started. Chapter 2. The Secrets in the Silk Buy. The time Charles A. Farnsworth III had finished unloading his troubles, it was 12:17 p.m., dangerously close to the sacred lunch hour. Wolfe had already shifted twice in his chair, which was his version of banging a gong and shouting that time was up. I closed my notebook, which now contained more dirt on Manhattan's upper crust than the Daily Gazette could dream of printing. "You will, of course," Wolfe said, reaching for the bell pull. "Leave us now, Mr. Farnsworth. I require sustenance before I commit to any professional exertion." Farnsworth stood reluctantly. "You'll take the case?" Wolfe gave him a look that could have been bottled and sold as Patience, limited edition. "Mr. Goodwin and I will review your information. You will be informed." Farnsworth hesitated, then nodded stiffly, and allowed Fritz to escort him out, his $1,000 shoes whispering. Across the carpet, I waited until the front door closed before turning to Wolfe. "Admit it," I said. "You're hooked. Moths, secret notes, threats. It's got all your favorite flavors, except edible." Wolfe scowled. "Piffle. A triviality, likely born of personal scandal. A secretary spurned, a valet dismissed." I knew better. Wolfe only went into full piffle mode when something had already grabbed his brain and was twisting. "Sure," I said agreeably. "Still, you're going to have me poking around Farnsworth. Manor. Might want to loosen up your armchair for the heavy thinking." Wolfe grunted, which meant yes. Lunch, mercifully, was up to Fritz's usual standards. Squab under glass, haricots verts, and a chocolate torte that made me forget briefly that my next stop was snooping around the kind of household where closets had bigger secrets than Fort Knox. After lunch, Wolfe summoned me back to the office with the precision of a Swiss train schedule. "You will visit the manor," he said, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. "Commence with the staff. Observe. Elicit. confidence, particularly among the servants. It is among the unseen gears that the machine betrays itself. Charming, I said. Shall I bring a wrench? He ignored me. The butler, the housekeeper, the valet, the maids. Discreet inquiries. Note anything peculiar, especially regarding moths, closets, or suspicious activities. I require their names, tenures, habits, and any observable friction. I stood. And if someone tries to pin me to the closet door? Endeavour to resist, Wolfe said dryly. Fritz will prepare a carafe of coffee. For your return, I suspect you will require it. By 2:30, I was climbing into the roadster, with a file full of rich man's sins, and a gut feeling that Charles A. Farnsworth III had left out more than he had shared. Farnsworth Manor was a sprawling stone edifice parked just south of the Ed, Westchester line. It looked like someone had ordered Castle out of a catalogue and decided to upgrade all the options. Gravel crunched under my tyres as I pulled up to a wrought-iron gate that was too heavy for even Manhattan's arrogance. A liveried guard appeared from a booth, all chest and no neck. Archie Goodwin, I said, flashing a winning smile and my licence. Mr. Farnsworth is expecting me. The guard consulted a clipboard, gave me a grunt that might have passed for permission, and the gate swung open with a hydraulic hiss. Inside, the manor was a fever dream of money. Columns, chandeliers, enough oil paintings to start a small museum. A butler who looked embalmed greeted me in the foyer. "Mr. Goodwin," he intoned. "This way, if you please." I was ushered into a sitting room bigger than my apartment, where a selection of Farnsworth's immediate circle awaited. Apparently, Charles had decided to let the fox sniff the henhouse immediately. There were 5 of them. Celia Farnsworth, the wife, mid-40s, rail-thin, with the brittle tension of a woman who hadn't smiled sincerely since the stock market last crashed. Anthony Farnsworth, the heir, early 20s, sleek as a racehorse and twice as temperamental, judging by the sideways glare he shot me. Vivian Ashcroft, the family secretary, a blonde with sharp eyes and sharper nails, sitting perfectly poised with a notepad she hadn't touched. Dr. Edwin Hartley, the family physician, lean, professional, with the kind of handshake that felt like it had been sanitized for your protection. And Marcus Vance, the old friend and advisor. Translation, professional hanger-on, whose smile was just a little too practiced. They stared at me like I was a strange new germ that had floated off the Hudson. "I'll need a few minutes with each of you," I said pleasantly. Separately. Celia sniffed. "Is this necessary? Only if you want the blackmail, or whatever this is, handled discreetly," I said. "Otherwise, I can grab a bullhorn and let the cops handle it." That got a reaction. Celia went pale. Anthony rolled his eyes. Vivian clicked her pen nervously. Dr. Hartley frowned. Vance smirked like he knew a secret and was dying for someone to ask. I smiled thinly. "Let's start alphabetically, shall we?" It was going to be a long afternoon, and somewhere in this room, I had no doubt, was the moth, or the hand that pinned it. Chapter 3. A Closet Full of Questions. The interviews went about as smoothly as you'd expect when a stranger starts kicking the furniture in a millionaire's parlour. I started with Celia Farnsworth because she looked most likely to either crack or faint, and I had a personal policy against traumatizing the help before tea time. She perched stiffly on the edge of a velvet settee, her knuckles whitening against the teacup she refused to drink from. "I can't imagine who would do such a thing," she said, her voice brittle. "Charles has many acquaintances, business rivals, people who envy us." "Sure," I said, "but business rivals don't usually sneak into your closet and leave creepy notes. That's more of a personal touch." Her mouth thinned into a single disapproving line. "I wouldn't know about that." I gave her my best mild smile. "Of course. Where were you last night between 8 and 11? She blinked. "At the opera. Ada. Charles and I had a box. I made a note." "Anyone see you there besides the singers?" "Our friends, the Van der Haydens, shared the box," she said crisply. "You may call them." I jotted it down without comment. She wasn't my prime suspect, not yet, but it was clear she wasn't volunteering for the role of concerned spouse either. Her fear was all about scandal, not safety. Anthony Farnsworth was next. He slouched into the armchair like it owed him money, giving me a glare that would have peeled paint. "This is a waste of time," he said. "Some nut gets a kick out of a moth, and Dad goes running to a detective." "Trust fund nerves acting up?" I asked sweetly. He sneered. "You think someone's out to get him. Half the city's been waiting for him to keel over so they can carve up his empire. Any names you care to share?" Anthony gave a lazy shrug. "How much time do you have?" "All day, sunshine." He rolled his eyes and rattled off a few business competitors, most of whom had enough cash to hire hitmen if they wanted a guy dead, not prank him with insects. It was helpful only in the sense that it confirmed what I already knew. The Farnsworths had enemies lined up around the block. Vivian Ashcroft proved a little more entertaining. She met me in the study, her legs crossed, notepad discarded, and gave me the professional secretary's half-smile. "Ask your questions, Mr. Goodwin," she said, "but I'm billing Charles for the overtime." "Wouldn't dream of cheating on you," I said. "You've worked for the family for how long?" 6 years, she said smoothly. "Hired by Mr. Farnsworth's father originally. I stayed on. And last night?" "I was here," she said. "Working, as usual." "Anyone confirm that?" "The household staff saw me leave at 10. I always log out with Mr. Grimes." Mr. Grimes, the butler. I made another note. "Have you ever seen anything unusual around the house? Anyone acting squirrely?" Her lips twitched. "Define squirrely." "Leaving moths pinned to closet doors, for starters." Vivian shook her head slowly. "No, Mr. Goodwin, but I'd start with the people who have the most to lose if Charles's reputation tanks." "And you?" I asked lightly. "I have nothing to hide," she said, meeting my gaze without a flicker, which of course made her the most interesting so far. Dr. Hartley was quick and professional, like he had patients waiting to be cured of the sniffles. He vouched for Celia's opera story. He'd seen her there, though, from a distance. He knew of no physical ailments Farnsworth suffered from. Nothing terminal. Nothing that would motivate a preemptive scramble for the inheritance. He was boring, which in this crowd made him almost suspicious. Marcus Vance was the final course. He lounged against the fireplace like he belonged on a movie poster, nursing a drink he wasn't offering to share. "You think one of us did it?" he said, eyebrows raised. "I think somebody did it," I said. "And unless Farnsworth's ghostwriter has a twisted hobby, it's someone inside the circle." Vance chuckled. "You're wasting your time. Charles has bigger, enemies outside these walls than in? Care to give me a list? Sure, he said, tossing back the rest of his scotch. Start with everyone who ever lost a bid, a lawsuit, or a mistress to him. It'll only take you a decade. I wasn't getting much except attitude, but sometimes attitude was its own kind of clue. Vance didn't seem scared. He seemed amused, like he already knew the punchline and was waiting to see if I'd catch up. By the time I finished the interviews, the sun was starting to slip behind the manor's ridiculous spires. I checked the closet myself before leaving, because no decent detective takes someone else's word for it, even if that someone's bank account had its own gravitational pull. The walk-in closet was bigger than my bedroom. Silk, cashmere, and Italian leather hung like offerings to the gods of vanity. But there, right where Farnsworth said, was the pinhole mark in the wood panelling, and a small scrap of something I found under the closet stool. Too small to be, a note, too torn to read clearly, but the edges were stained red, ink or blood. Either way, it wasn't something you leave lying around by accident. I bagged it carefully, slipped it into my pocket, and made my way out before the manor's long shadows decided to close the doors behind me permanently. On the drive back to the brownstone, I turned it over in my mind, a moth pinned to the closet, a note about secrets, a family that hated the idea of sunlight almost as much as they hated each other. I didn't have the whole puzzle yet, but I had a corner piece, and if you know anything about puzzles, you know that's where you start. Chapter 4. The Man Behind the Moth Bee. The time I hauled myself back into Wolfe's office, the sun was long gone, and Manhattan had slipped into its second skin. Neon lights, cab horns, and a smell that was part ambition, part exhaust, and part whatever had died in the sewer system that day. Wolfe was, of course, exactly where I had left him. In his oversized chair, a glass of beer at hand, the book of orchids open on his lap. He did not look up as I entered. "You have something," he said without a hint of curiosity. "Maybe," I said, dropping into the red chair. "If you consider a dysfunctional family, a snotty heir, a secretary too slick for her own good, and a closet floor scrap worth your time," he sighed as if I were personally delaying his ascent to some higher plane of thought. "Proceed." I gave him the rundown. Celia's fear of scandal, Anthony's attitude problem, Vivian's poised indifference, Hartley's perfect alibi, Vance's barely concealed amusement, and the scrap, small, crimson-stained, and very much out of place. Wolfe finally deigned to open his eyes fully at that. "You have it?" I pulled the bagged scrap from my pocket and handed it over. Wolfe peered at it like it might sprout legs and start reciting Shakespeare. "Analysis is required," he murmured, almost to himself. "You will take it to Mr. Jarvis first, thing tomorrow." Jarvis was Wolfe's pet chemist, a man who could analyze a molecule faster than most people could spell it. If the red stain was anything unusual, Jarvis would know. "In the meantime," Wolfe said, "we will consider motives." He shifted in his chair, which was the Wolfe equivalent of pacing the room. "Blackmail requires leverage. The moth, the note, they are symbols. The threat is to reveal a secret. Therefore, we must ask, what secrets does Mr. Farnsworth possess that are dire enough to provoke such theatrics? "Judging by the way everyone acted," I said, "you could spin a whole Broadway season out of them." Affairs, debts, rivalries, Wolfe grunted. Trite. And yet fatal, I said. You don't pin moths for fun, not when you're rich enough to settle scores with lawyers. He tapped a thick forefinger against the desk. Mr. Farnsworth has not been. Candid. I didn't argue. It was obvious Farnsworth had dropped only the part of the story that wouldn't soil his designer carpets. The real grime was still stuck under his manicured fingernails. You will telephone him in the morning, Wolfe said. Request a complete list of personal entanglements, debts, mistresses, secret investments, litigation, everything. I raised an eyebrow. You think he'll just hand it over? You will impress upon him, Wolfe said dryly, the necessity of full disclosure if he wishes to continue breathing blackmailed. And if he says no? Wolfe gave a slow, satisfied smile. Then we withdraw, and he may explain to the press how C.A. Death's Head Moth became his social obituary. Farnsworth wouldn't risk that. I'd seen the terror in his eyes. The man wasn't worried about losing money. He was worried about losing everything money couldn't buy. I stood. Anything else before I turn in? Yes. Wolfe pointed at me like an orchestra conductor cueing the violins. You will also discreetly investigate the staff, Mr. Grimes in particular. The butler, indeed. Mr. Grimes controls access to the house, schedules deliveries. He is positioned perfectly for both surveillance and sabotage. Charming, I said. If the butler did it, I'll buy you a new orchid, Wolfe harumphed, which in his language meant, see that you are not an imbecile while doing so. I retreated to my room upstairs, stripping off the day's armour and slipping into the kind of sleep you only get when your head's full of moths, millionaires, and secrets that smelled like they were about to rot. Morning came too soon. After a hurried breakfast and a few threatening words from Fritz about the sacrilege of gulping coffee, I set out first for Jarvis's lab. The lab sat over a shoe repair shop on East 34th, marked by nothing but a brass plaque so dull you had to know what you were looking for. Jarvis himself looked like a scarecrow who had misplaced his field. Tall, bony, glasses perched on the end of a nose that would have been perfect for a bloodhound. He took the scrap from me with a grunt and shuffled off to work. I spent the next 20 minutes flipping through a 3-week-old New Yorker while he muttered and clanked in the back. Finally, he emerged. Not blood, he said without ceremony. Ink. What kind? He held up a slip of paper. Vintage, aniline-based red ink. Manufactured mid-1930s. Expensive even then. Rare now. Rare enough to trace. He shrugged. If you find someone who treasures antique fountain pens, maybe. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I thanked him, stuffed the bag back into my pocket, and headed out. Time to call Farnsworth and twist his arm until the real dirt fell out. And then, if I was lucky, pay a little visit to Mr. Grimes, who might just have been the man behind the moth. Chapter 5. The Butler's Blunder. I was halfway down the brownstone's front steps, heading toward the car, when the phone in the hallway shrieked like a banshee, in a bad mood. Fritz, polishing the brass railings, nodded toward it with an expression that said, "It's yours, whether you want it or not." I jogged back in and snagged the receiver. Archie Goodwin. "Mr. Goodwin, this is Charles Farnsworth." His voice sounded strained, brittle as dry leaves. Either the thought of coughing up his secrets had kept him awake all night, or something new had put the squeeze on him. "I trust you've considered our conversation," I said. "Yes, I understand the necessity. I have compiled a list. You'll need to deliver it personally." There was a long pause. "That won't be necessary. I can send it with Grimes." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Mr. Farnsworth, unless you want your trusted butler reading it before it hits Wolfe's desk, you'd better bring it yourself." Another pause, thicker this time. "Very well. I'll come at 2:00. I hung up, grabbed my coat, and set off toward Farnsworth Manor. Wolfe wanted the staff checked out anyway, and if Grimes was running interference, better I found out now, before the butler decided to pin a few moths on me. When I arrived, Grimes was already waiting at the door, his funereal face carved in professional politeness. "Mr. Goodwin," he said without enthusiasm, "we were not informed of your visit." "That's because I like surprises," I said, stepping inside. "Tell Mr. Farnsworth I'll be in the library." Grimes inclined his head a fraction of an inch and disappeared down a hallway. The library smelled of leather, dust, and money. A fire crackled half-heartedly in the hearth, and the heavy curtains blocked out most of the midday light, giving the whole room a permanent hangover. I wandered over to the massive desk and idly fingered a silver-framed photograph. Farnsworth and a woman who looked suspiciously like a younger Celia, smiling in a way she hadn't managed since my first visit. Behind me, the door creaked open. Grimes returned bearing a silver tray with a crystal decanter and a glass. "Refreshment, sir?" I glanced at the decanter. Amber liquid. Probably something that cost more per sip than my weekly salary. But I wasn't here to sample the goods. No thanks. I'm here to talk. Alone. Grimes set the tray down with glacial slowness. "Mr. Farnsworth is currently engaged. He requests your patience." I smiled. "Sure. Patience is my middle name." "It isn't, but I find people are more agreeable when you don't start fights in the foyer." Grimes made a stiff exit, and I took the opportunity to wander. I wasn't expecting to find a body stuffed behind the drapes, but old habits die hard. Instead, I found something even better. A side door, tucked behind a row of bookshelves, slightly ajar. I moved toward it, keeping my footsteps light. It opened onto a service corridor, narrow and dimly lit. Another door stood halfway down, this one leading into what looked like a private sitting room. And in the sitting room, neatly stacked on a low table, was a collection of letters. Normally, I don't snoop without a warrant, or at least a really good excuse. But considering someone in this house had a flair for the dramatic involving dead moths and creepy notes, I figured moral high ground was already ankle-deep. I flipped through the letters quickly. Most were harmless. Thank you notes, invitations, the usual social ephemera of the rich and restless. But one envelope caught my eye. It was unmarked. No return address, no stamp. Just a heavy cream-coloured paper and a faint, lingering scent of something sharp and chemical. I slid the letter out. It wasn't long. One secret for each wing. The past is a hungry moth. Feed it, or be consumed. Same handwriting style as the note pinned with the moth, at least from what Farnsworth had described. Red ink, thick and vivid. I tucked it back into its envelope, careful not to disturb the pile more than necessary. and slipped out of the room just as I heard Grimes's footfalls echoing down the corridor. I was back in the library, admiring a first edition of the Federalist Papers when Grimes reappeared. "Mr. Farnsworth will see you now," he said stiffly. "Finally," I said. "Lead the way." But as I followed him, something nagged at me. It wasn't the letter, or the hidden sitting room, or even the fact that Farnsworth was dragging his feet harder than a guilty kid at confession. It was Grimes himself. The butler had polished shoes, impeccable tie, starched cuffs, but there, barely visible on his right sleeve, was a smear of something reddish-brown, and I knew damn well it wasn't wine. I filed it away without a word, and followed him up the grand staircase, the letter burning a hole in my pocket and the first real threads of a trap starting to weave themselves in my mind. Someone inside this house wasn't just rattling skeletons. They were getting ready to shove a whole closet full right onto Farnsworth's head. And if I didn't watch my step, I might end up pinned to the door next. Chapter 6. Secrets for Sale Farnsworth's private study was the kind of room that took itself too seriously. Dark panelling, heavy drapes, enough oil paintings of grim-faced ancestors to host a family reunion of the damned. He stood behind a massive walnut desk, fingers drumming against a leather blotter, as Grimes ushered me inside. The butler withdrew with a silent glide, leaving me alone with a man who looked like he'd aged a decade since our last meeting. "You have the list?" I asked, stepping closer. Farnsworth nodded, producing a manila envelope from a drawer and sliding it across the desk like it might explode. I picked it up, weighing it in my hand. It was heavy. Messy lives usually are. "Anything else I should know before I dig in?" He hesitated, his mouth working like he was chewing on barbed wire. "There's more," he admitted, "but it would be catastrophic if it came to light." "Define catastrophic," I said. "Financial ruin, scandal, jail time?" "All three," he said quietly. I whistled low. "You sure know how to pick your secrets." Didn't smile. I tucked the envelope under my arm. "You'll hear from us soon, assuming you're still breathing." That got a flicker of humour, or maybe just indigestion. I left him standing there, framed by the gloomy portraits of men who probably made their fortunes selling snake oil and steel, and headed back towards the grand staircase. Halfway down, I heard a sound, a sharp, muffled argument somewhere behind the west wing. I paused, straining my ears. Two voices, both low and furious. I edged closer. "Warned you," a man hissed. "You think you can just walk away." "Keep your voice down, you fool," a woman snapped. I couldn't see them, but the acoustics of a 100-year-old mansion have their uses. "You're in just as deep," the man said. "If this blows up, don't think you'll skate free." "I have contingencies," the woman said coldly. "Can you say the same?" Footsteps scraped against stone. I ducked back behind a column just as Vivian Ashcroft swept past, her heels clicking like a metronome set to trouble. She didn't see me. Too focused on the phone she whipped out of her handbag as she disappeared into the east wing. A few seconds later, Marcus Vance followed, his face tight and furious. Well, looks like the secretary and the old friend were doing more after-hours strategizing than Farnsworth realized. I let them go. No sense tipping my hand yet. I had bigger fish to fry, starting with a little heart-to-heart with Wolfe. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in his usual state of post-lunch contemplation, a bottle of beer sweating on the desk, and a small dictionary open to some obscure page, just to keep his brain limber between meals. I dropped the envelope onto his blotter. "Compliments of Mr. Farnsworth," I said. "All the dirt that's fit to bury him." Wolfe arched an eyebrow, opened the envelope with a silver paper knife, and began thumbing through the contents. As he read, I filled him in on the rest. The secret hallway, the unmarked letter in red ink, the cosy conversation between Vivian and Vance. When I finished, Wolfe set the papers down with a sigh. "Predictable," he said. "You mean you already knew Vivian was involved?" "I suspected," Wolfe said. "Miss Ashcroft's salary was too modest for her wardrobe, and her attention to Mr. Farnsworth's affairs too punctilious." He tapped the letter I had found at the manor. "This was written with antique ink, yes?" "According to Jarvis. Expensive stuff. Rare." "Then the sender is someone with a taste for old things, or someone making a point about the past." "Or both," I said. "Vivian and Vance were arguing about contingencies. Sounds like whatever leverage they've got, it's enough to make them turn on each other." Wolfe nodded. "You will arrange a meeting. Here." "With who?" "Both," he said. "Miss Ashcroft and Mr. Vance, simultaneously. Their reactions will tell us everything we need to know." I grimaced. "You think they'll just waltz into the lion's den?" "You will persuade them," Wolfe said, steepling his fingers. "By what? Threatening to spill the dirt myself?" He smiled thinly. "Mr. Goodwin, you are at your most effective when you allow people to believe the disaster is of their own making." Which was Wolfe's delicate way of saying, "Make them sweat." I picked up the phone and started dialing. Time to throw a little gasoline on a very dry fire and see who ran out first. Chapter 7. The Gathering of the Guilty. It took a few strategic calls, a hint of urgency, and one or two outright lies. But by 6:30 that evening, Vivian Ashcroft and Marcus Vance were both scheduled to arrive at the brownstone within the hour. Wolfe, of course, refused to abandon his dinner, so I played gatekeeper, ready to do the delicate work of rattling the cages before the lion made his entrance. Vivian showed up first, punctual as a Swiss clock. She wore a navy skirt suit so sharp it could have cut glass, her blonde hair pinned into a flawless chignon. She gave me a tight smile as I opened the door, the kind reserved for waiters who spill drinks and men who ask inconvenient questions. "Mr. Goodwin," she said coolly, "you made it sound urgent." "It is," I said, ushering her inside. "Come on in. We're just waiting for one more guest." Her eyes flickered just for a second, and she adjusted the strap of her handbag. A nervous tell if I ever saw one. I led her into the office, offered a seat, and let her stew under Wolfe's disapproving stare, even though Wolfe didn't glance up from his book. 5 minutes later, Marcus Vance sauntered in, all tan charm and casual menace. His sports coat was slung over one shoulder, and he carried the air of a man who knew just how much rope he had, and how tight it was getting. "You certainly know how to make things sound exciting, Goodwin," he said, dropping into a chair without waiting for an invitation. "What's the emergency?" "That depends," I said, shutting the door behind me. "How do you feel about moths?" Vance's smile faltered for just a second. Vivian stiffened. Wolfe finally closed his book with a snap placed it neatly on the table, and leaned back. "I dislike melodrama," he said. "Therefore, I will speak plainly. You are both here because you are connected to the matter of Mr. Farnsworth's difficulties." Vivian opened her mouth to protest, but Wolfe lifted a finger, and she closed it, again like a chastised schoolgirl. "You, Miss Ashcroft," Wolfe continued, "have access to Mr. Farnsworth's personal correspondence, schedules, and confidences. You, Mr. Vance, are close enough to him and to his enemies to be a conduit for information." "That's nonsense," Vance said quickly. "I've been loyal to Charles for years." "As a jackal is loyal to the lion until the carcass is stripped clean," Wolfe said, unimpressed. "Your recent financial difficulties, Mr. Vance, are well documented." Vance flushed, then tried to shrug it off. "Investments, everyone's taken a hit." "Indeed," Wolfe said, "but not everyone responds by attempting extortion." Vivian shifted in her seat. "You have no proof." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, "Mr. Goodwin recovered a letter, written in vintage aniline ink, tucked away where only an insider could have placed it. And we have overheard enough to confirm collusion." Vance glared at Vivian. "You said it would be clean." Vivian turned on him like a whip. "And you were supposed to keep your mouth shut." They broke into a low, furious argument, hissing at each other across Wolfe's desk like snakes in a barrel. Wolfe let it run for a moment, studying them the way a cat watches a pair of tangled mice. Leaned casually against the desk. "You want me to guess, or are you going to save us all some time and spill it?" Vivian snapped her gaze to me, her composure cracking. "It wasn't supposed to get this far," she said. "We only wanted him to pay, to acknowledge what he did." Wolfe's voice cut in, soft and lethal. "What precisely did he do?" Vivian's hands twisted in her lap. "He ruined people, Mr. Wolfe, lives, careers. He buried things, made them disappear. Marcus had a brother, one of the casualties." Vance nodded grimly. "Blackballed from every firm in New York. Farnsworth didn't want to get out." "And you believed," Wolfe said coldly, "that childish riddles and theatrical threats would somehow balance the scales?" Vivian pressed her lips together. "We didn't intend violence," she said. "Just exposure." "Exposure," Wolfe said, leaning forward, "is an uncontrollable fire. You cannot aim it without burning your own hands. They both looked deflated now, like two balloons finally realizing the parade was over." "And the moth?" I asked. "Whose brilliant idea was that?" Vivian flushed. "Marcus knew a man, an artist. He used preserved insects. It was symbolic." "Symbolism is wasted on fools," Wolfe said. "You assumed Mr. Farnsworth would quietly settle. Instead, you stirred a pot you could not control." There was a knock at the office door. Fritz's voice floated through, polite but firm. "Inspector Kramer is here. Perfect timing." Wolfe stood smooth as a judge rising from the bench. "Mr. Goodwin, if you please. Our guests have confessions to make." As I crossed to open the door for Kramer, and the legal storm he always brought with him, I couldn't help smiling a little. Not because the case was wrapped up neatly. It never really was. But because watching Wolfe corner people, with nothing but logic and disdain, was one of the few pure pleasures left in an impure world. And I had a feeling this case still had 1 or 2 months hiding in its corners. Chapter 8. The Secret That Wouldn't Stay. Buried, Inspector Kramer barreled into the office like a locomotive that had forgotten how to brake. His fedora was jammed low on his forehead, his jaw was working overtime, and he smelled faintly of cigars and righteous indignation. "What the devil is this, Wolfe?" he barked, scanning the room and spotting Vivian and Vance sitting stiff as frozen pigeons. "You summon me down here for a social call or a roundup?" Wolfe, who had resumed his seat with imperial calm, gestured toward the two guests. "Mr. Vance and Miss Ashcroft have information relevant to the matter of Mr. Charles Farnsworth and certain attempts at extortion." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "Extortion, huh?" I stepped forward. "They cooked up a little blackmail scheme involving secret letters, pinned moths, and enough theatrical flair to start a second-rate mystery company. Wolfe's got the evidence. They've got the guilty faces." Kramer grunted and pulled out a battered notepad. "Start talking," he ordered, jabbing a finger at Vance. It wasn't pretty. It never is when the tough guy routine collapses. Vance and Vivian broke down in tandem, half anger, half exhaustion, and spilled the whole miserable plot. How they had gathered information about Farnsworth's shady deals, how they'd used the moths as a symbol of decay and secrecy, how they believed he would pay to keep his reputation untarnished. Kramer scribbled like a man racing a deadline. "Charges will stick," he muttered. "Conspiracy, attempted blackmail, maybe more if the DA's feeling frisky." Vivian, her poise now nothing but an ugly memory, glared at Wolfe. "You don't understand. Farnsworth, he's worse than you know." Wolfe didn't blink. "That may be, but you are neither judge or jury, Miss Ashcroft." Kramer cuffed them both verbally, then physically, with a pair of gleaming bracelets from his coat pocket. Fritz opened the door without being asked, and the two of them were hustled out into the New York night, where the flashing red and blue of a patrol car waited at the curb. Silence fell over the office, thick and satisfying. Wolfe reached for his beer with a sigh of something perilously close to satisfaction. I dropped back into my chair and stretched my legs out. "Case closed," I said. "You want me to pop a cork, or just do a victory lap around the orchids?" Wolfe gave me a withering glance. "Restrain yourself, Mr. Goodwin. The matter is concluded, but not satisfactorily." That stopped me. "You're kidding! We nailed them! Confessions, motive, means, opportunity, wrapped up in a neat bow." Wolfe set his glass down with a faint clink. "I abhor neatness. It suggests that something has been brushed under the carpet." Me steepled his fingers, gazing over them. Miss Ashcroft's vehemence, Mr. Vance's desperation. They are not the root of the matter. They are symptoms. "You think there's more?" I asked. "I am certain of it," Wolfe said. And just like that, the comfortable buzz of a solved case evaporated. Wolfe turned his gaze toward the envelope Farnsworth had provided, still resting on the corner of the desk. "The true secret," Wolfe said softly, "remains hidden." He tapped the envelope once, sharply, "and we are going to find it." Chapter 9. Moths. Around the Flame. I knew Wolfe well enough to recognize the signs. A certain rigidity of posture, a gleam behind the half-closed eyes, a slow and deliberate tapping of fingers against the desk. The man was chewing on something, and whatever it wasn't going to let him sleep easily. I gave it a beat, then said, "You want to clue me in, boss? Or should I just stand here and admire your process?" He ignored the sarcasm, as he often did when he was 2 steps ahead of the universe. Instead, he reached for the envelope from Farnsworth and fanned its contents across the desk like a cheap poker hand. "Examine these," Wolfe said. I leaned over and scanned the documents, lists of past business ventures, discrete financial payoffs, property acquisitions under dummy corporations, a few out-of-wedlock financial settlements that would have sunk a less wealthy man like a stone. Ugly, sure, but nothing worth risking. Blackmail charges when half the city's power brokers were swimming in the same swamp. I straightened. "It's grubby, but it's not the kind of thing you need to start pinning insects for." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "The venom we saw in Miss Ashcroft, her vehemence, was not the anger of opportunistic extortionists. It was personal, emotional." "And Vance, equally desperate," Wolfe said, "but opportunistic. He attached himself to a cause he thought could enrich him." I dropped into the chair across from Wolfe and crossed my arms. "So, what are we missing?" He folded his hands over his midsection. "The moths, Mr. Goodwin. The moths." I waited. He hated explaining anything before he was ready, but eventually he indulged me. "The death's head hawk moth is a symbol of death," Wolfe said, "not merely secrecy. Death. This was never simply about exposing Farnsworth's crimes. It was about a death connected to him. A cold little knot formed in my gut. You think Farnsworth is hiding something worse?" Wolfe nodded, and it would have to be something grievous enough that exposure would not merely tarnish him, it would destroy him. I whistled low. "Murder?" "Possibly," Wolfe said. He plucked up a sheet from the pile, a list of names people Farnsworth had dealt with over the last 20 years, and jabbed a finger at one near the bottom. Francis Vance. Marcus Vance's brother. Francis Vance, Wolfe continued, was a junior partner at Farnsworth & Cole. Promising, ambitious, but conveniently ruined by scandal at a critical moment. Shortly after, he died. "Allegedly of suicide. Allegedly," I echoed. Wolfe nodded once, sharply. "Too neatly dismissed, especially considering the financial irregularities that surfaced after his death. Irregularities that benefited Mr. Farnsworth's position immensely." I leaned forward, heart picking up speed. "You're saying Farnsworth engineered a scandal, destroyed the kid's life, and then, what, pushed him to it?" "Or arranged it," Wolfe said flatly. "I do not speculate idly." The pieces clicked together in my mind with a sickening snap. Vivian's anger, Marcus's desperation, the moth pinned inside the closet, a warning that Farnsworth's carefully buried sins were about to hatch out in the open. "And if we can prove it," I said slowly, "then blackmail the least of Farnsworth's problems." Wolfe nodded. "Precisely. But we require evidence, not supposition." I stood. "All right. Where do we start?" Wolfe's eyes glittered. "With the body," he said. "Mr. Francis Vance was buried quietly, with little investigation. That will change." He reached for the phone and began dialing with grim purpose. As the rotary spun, I felt the air in the brownstone shift. The case wasn't closed, not even close. We had caught the moths. Now it was time to hunt the hand that lit the flame that lured them. And something told me Charles Farnsworth III had far more to lose than a little scandal and a little pride. He had blood on his hands, and it was finally time to wipe them clean or be exposed under a very harsh light. Chapter 10. Digging up the past it took less than 24 hours to stir the hornet's nest. Inspector Kramer, bulldog that he was, grumbled and cursed, but made the necessary calls. With Wolfe applying just enough behind-the-scenes pressure and a few whispers to the right ears downtown, the authorities agreed to quietly revisit the death of Francis Vance. Nothing official yet, no grand exhumations or front-page headlines. Just a low-key inquiry into what had been written off as an open-and-shut case nearly 3 years ago. Meanwhile, Wolfe sent me back into the field. "You will speak to the coroner who certified Mr. Vance's death," he ordered. "Confirm the circumstances. Find the cracks." Which was how I found myself at the battered offices of Dr. Milton Hecht, a coroner who had clearly decided 20 years ago that fashion and furniture upgrades were unnecessary extravagances. Hecht was a squat, balding man with a permanent coffee stain on his shirt and a voice that rasped like a sandpaper violin. When I showed him my license and dropped Francis Vance's name, he frowned and rummaged through a battered filing cabinet. "Suicide," he said eventually, flipping through yellowed papers. "No autopsy requested. Family declined." "No autopsy," I repeated. He shrugged. "Not uncommon. Wealthy families. Embarrassment. They don't want headlines." I leaned forward. Was there anything odd? Anything that might have suggested a second look was needed? He scratched his chin. Blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a fall from height, his apartment balcony. No signs of struggle, no witnesses. I drummed my fingers on the edge of the desk. "No signs of struggle, huh? Are you sure about that?" Hecht peered at the report again. Wait, there was some talk about scratches, fingernails broken, minor contusions inconsistent with the fall itself. And nobody thought that was worth checking. He shrugged again, helpless. Family insisted it was a suicide. Police didn't push. It was wrapped up fast, like tying a bow around a body and shoving it into the ground. I thanked him, left the office, and called Wolfe from a payphone. He answered on the first ring. "Report. Minor injuries inconsistent with a fall. Broken fingernails, scratches. Somebody might have helped him take the plunge." There was a satisfied grunt at the other end of the line. "Good. Return at once." When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was already moving faster than usual, which in his case meant he had abandoned his chair to stand at the windows, frowning at the spring rain falling on 35th Street. He turned as I entered. "We have enough to act," he said. "Mr. Farnsworth must be confronted. Tonight." I raised an eyebrow. "You expect him to just confess?" Wolfe gave me a look usually reserved for people who asked if he liked jogging. "No, Mr. Goodwin, I expect him to react, and from that reaction we shall deduce the truth." He issued orders with brisk precision. I was to summon Charles Farnsworth to the brownstone under the pretext of finalizing the case against Vivian Ashcroft and Marcus Vance. A simple meeting, nothing alarming. What Farnsworth wouldn't know was that we would also have Inspector Kramer waiting in the wings, just in case things turned lively. At precisely 8:30, Farnsworth arrived, looking like a man who had spent the day chewing glass. His suit was immaculate, but his tie was askew, and there was a greyness under his eyes that no amount of wealth could hide. He took one look at the room, Wolfe behind his desk, me lounging nearby, and bristled like a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. "You said you had news," he barked. "We do," Wolfe said calmly. "Please sit." Farnsworth did stiffly. Wolfe leaned forward, folding his hands atop the blotter. "Mr. Farnsworth," he said, voice cool and deliberate, "it is my duty to inform you that evidence has surfaced suggesting your former associate, Francis Vance, did not commit suicide of his own volition." Farnsworth froze just for a second, but in this office 1 second was a lifetime. "You're mistaken," he said. "That case was closed." "It was," Wolfe agreed, "prematurely, conveniently. Now it has been reopened." Farnsworth's hands twitched. On the arms of the chair. "You have no proof," he said. Wolfe's mouth curved into a thin smile. "We have enough to warrant further inquiry," he said. "Enough to raise questions. Enough to raise a warrant." There was a knock. I opened the door, and Kramer stepped inside, hat in hand, badge glinting. Farnsworth paled visibly. "This is outrageous," he hissed. "You can't do this." "I assure you," Wolfe said, "we can, and we shall." Farnsworth's chest rose and fell rapidly. His gaze darted to the door, the windows, as if calculating escape routes. But there were none. "Francis Vance was going to ruin me," he spat. "He had documents, evidence, false accusations. He wanted to tear down everything I built." "And so you silenced him," Wolfe said. "No," Farnsworth shouted. He confronted me. We fought. It was an accident." The words echoed through the room like a gunshot. Kramer stepped forward. That's all I needed to hear. As he read Farnsworth his rights, Wolfe leaned back in his chair with a deep, weary sigh. Another web untangled. Another monster dragged into the light. And another reminder, in case we'd ever forgotten, that the richest closets in New York always had the biggest skeletons. Some just took a little more digging to find. Chapter 11. Ashes and Aftermath. By 9:30, Charles Farnsworth III was on his way downtown, in the back seat of a black and white, flanked by two stony-faced officers. Inspector Kramer left with him, grumbling about paperwork and the sorry state of the city's elite. The brownstone door swung shut behind them with a finality that echoed through the front hall. In the office, silence settled like dust after a demolition. Wolfe remained seated, his expression unreadable. Fingertips pressed together under his chin, I stretched out in the red chair, feeling the kind of exhausted satisfaction that comes after finally yanking the last thread free of a particularly nasty knot. "So," I said, tilting my head back, "that's that." Wolfe opened his eyes, slow and heavy-lidded. "No, Mr. Goodwin, that is not that." I groaned. "Please tell me you're not about to invent a second murderer." He allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "No," he said, "only a reflection. Consider, Archie, the trajectory of this case. At every turn, we saw individuals manoeuvring not for justice, but for leverage. Even those ostensibly seeking retribution, Miss Ashcroft, Mr. Vance, were motivated less by principle than by bitterness and self-interest." I sat up a little straighter. Wolfe's philosophy lectures usually meant he was about to land a punch you didn't see coming. "It is a common failing," Wolfe continued. "Those who attempt to rectify old injustices seldom cleanse themselves of their own corruption. They merely perpetuate the rot in a different shape." I nodded slowly. "You're saying the moths didn't just symbolize death. They symbolize the decay already in all of them." "Precisely." He leaned back in his chair with a grunt, reaching for his beer. Fritz must have anticipated the end of the storm, because a fresh bottle and a chilled glass waited on a silver tray at Wolfe's elbow. I rose and crossed to the window. Outside, the city gleamed under a cold spring rain. Taxis prowled the wet streets, and somewhere far off, a saxophone bled a slow, lonely tune into the night air. "You know," I said, turning back toward Wolfe, "if you ever wanted to ditch the orchids, you could make a killing writing poetry." He snorted, a low sound of pure derision. "Piffle!" I laughed under my breath and went to hang up my coat. There was a small comfort in the way things always returned to normal at the brownstone after a case. Wolfe brooding in his chair, beer glass sweating into a coaster. Fritz humming faintly in the kitchen. The city's chaos held at bay for a little while longer by thick brick walls, good food and stubborn intellect, and me, already wondering how long it would be before the next desperate knock on the door, the next twisted riddle delivered on a silver platter. Because if there's one thing you can count on in New York, it's that someone, somewhere, is always hiding a moth in their closet. And sooner or later, they come fluttering out. Chapter 12. The Last Wing Beat. The next morning broke with a crisp grey drizzle that suited the city's mood and mine. Kramer called early, his voice short and sour, but there was a certain satisfaction lurking under the gravel. "Farnsworth's confession holds," he said. "He claims the fight with Francis Vance was accidental, but the DA's not feeling merciful. He's going to be charged with second-degree manslaughter, at minimum." "Better than nothing," I said. I was half afraid he'd wriggle out with a lawyer and a large cheque. "Not this time," Kramer said grimly. "Public pressure's too hot. The papers are already sniffing around." I hung up and relayed the news to Wolfe, who simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a minor disturbance in the grand flow of orchids and mealtimes. By noon, the world outside the brownstone had moved on to fresher scandals, but inside, Wolfe insisted on a formal conclusion, as he always did, a summing up for the record, even if the only witnesses were me, a few stubborn ferns, and a house already too full of secrets. He called me into the office after lunch. Fritz, sensing a ceremony, provided coffee strong enough to wake the dead and a plate of almond biscuits. Wolfe, seated behind his desk, steepled his fingers and began, voice slow and deliberate. "The case of Charles Farnsworth III, he said, was not a matter of simple blackmail, nor of amateur extortion. It was a parable of decay. A man who, by all appearances, embodied wealth, power, and respectability, but whose foundations were hollow, gnawed from within by the rot of his own actions." I nodded, sipping my coffee. "Francis Vance's death," Wolfe continued, "was the silent earthquake that shattered that foundation. His brother Marcus and Miss Ashcroft, misguided and bitter, sought vengeance through exposure and humiliation. They chose symbols, moths, messages to shake Farnsworth's carefully constructed facade. He allowed himself a small, sour smile. But their methods, as crude as they were, succeeded only in bringing to light what justice had once ignored. That is the only redemption to be found here. I set my cup down. And what about Vivian and Vance? Think the courts will go easy on them? Perhaps, Wolfe said. They lacked the true venom of murderers, but they will pay for their folly nonetheless, as will Farnsworth. He leaned back with a grunt of finality, signalling the end of the lecture. I stood and stretched. Well, all tied up, boss. No loose ends. Just the way you like it. Bah, Wolfe said, reaching for his book. There are always loose ends, Mr. Goodwin. Life does not allow for true neatness, only the illusion of it. I grinned. You're a regular barrel of laughs today. Ignoring me, he opened his tome and began reading, retreating into the world of orchids and ancient Latin scholars, with the serene satisfaction of a man who had, once again, proved the superiority of methodical thought over human folly. I wandered into the hallway, whistling under my breath. Outside, the rain had eased into a fine mist, blurring the city into watercolour shades of grey and silver. Another case closed, another secret pulled into the light, and somewhere, I was sure, in some grand brownstone or crumbling walk-up, another moth was beating its dusty wings behind another locked door, waiting for someone foolish or desperate enough to let it out. And when they did, Nero Wolfe and I would be ready, like always, waiting, listening, and very much awake.